I wasn't expecting anyone to be in the bookstore this late. Most people left hours ago, leaving the dim hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint smell of old paper lingering like a half-forgotten memory. I was reorganizing a shelf of travel guides when I heard it, the soft scrape of heels on linoleum. "She's here," my brain whispered before my eyes even registered her. She walked past me without saying anything, and for a second, I froze. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she moved through the space like she belonged there, like the world subtly shifted to make room for her. Mid-40s, but the kind of confidence that isn't loud or flashy, more like gravity. There was a quiet elegance in how her coat fell over her shoulders, how she lingered near the poetry section, scanning titles with a kind of curiosity that seemed almost personal. And then, she leaned slightly, just enough for her voice to brush against my ear. "I've been waiting for you." I dropped the travel guide I was holding. I know, it sounds like a line from a movie, but hers wasn't performative. There wasn't a smirk, no teasing undertone, just a softness in the way the words landed. They weren't an invitation, exactly. They were a statement. Like she'd been aware of me for longer than I'd been aware of her. I coughed, tried to pull myself together, and mumbled something incoherent. She didn't correct me. She smiled, small and private, like she knew exactly how flustered I was and found it interesting. Or maybe comforting. I couldn't tell. I watched her lean down to adjust a stack of books on the lower shelf, the faint curve of her wrist catching the light. It wasn't just her hands. It was the care, the way she paused over a title, then gently nudged it back into place, like she was restoring order not just to the books, but to everything around her. And in that pause, our eyes met. Just a flicker, a brush. My chest tightened, and I'm almost sure mine betrayed me before my brain could. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words got caught somewhere between hello and what the hell just happened. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, not overpowering, just enough to make me feel like the air itself was different now. She straightened up, smiled again, and walked toward the counter, humming a tune I didn't recognize. I found myself standing there long after she left my line of sight, staring at the space where she had been. The hum of the lights seemed louder now, the air heavier, as if I'd walked into a room that had been waiting for something I wasn't ready to name. And then I realized, the oddest part wasn't that she'd said those words. It was that I couldn't stop hearing them, over and over, like a record stuck on a phrase that made no sense, and yet felt inevitable. I don't know why she waited, or for how long, or if she even expected anything from me. But I couldn't shake the way her eyes had held mine for a fraction too long, the subtle tilt of her head that made it feel like she was listening to something I wasn't saying. Later, I'd catch myself replaying that whisper, imagining all the reasons she could have said it. I'd feel the brush of her presence in the quiet corner of the bookstore, long after the door had closed behind her, long after the echo of her heels had faded. And I'd realize something I wasn't ready to admit. I'd been waiting too, without knowing it. And now I couldn't stop thinking about the exact moment she had walked past me and made it impossible to forget. The next time I saw her, it was in the back corner of the bookstore, near the cramped cafe nook. I was stacking a new shipment of books when she appeared again, this time with a canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder, a notebook peeking out like a secret she hadn't decided to share. "Could you help me reach the top shelf?" she asked, and I noticed she said it almost as an afterthought, like asking wasn't something she usually did. Her voice was soft, but deliberate. I moved closer, noticing the faint tremor in her fingers as she handed me a thin hardcover. I caught myself staring at the small, precise way she adjusted her sleeves, as though trying to disguise the fact that she hadn't wanted to ask for help. She didn't look at me as I handed her the book. Instead, she tilted her head down, flipping the pages lightly, and I realized her guard wasn't casual. It was intentional. She was always measured, never letting anyone see what was under the surface. "You always organize this section?" I asked, trying for casual, but my voice sounded too loud in the quiet. She lifted her eyes just slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Not always. I sometimes just come by." She glanced down at the book again, fingers lingering a second too long over the spine, like she was afraid to admit why she was there. I noticed the way the light caught her hair, strands brushing against her cheek as she leaned over the shelf. And then, her laugh. A short, quiet thing that came out when she realized she'd misjudged a row of books. It wasn't meant for me, not exactly, but I felt it, the soft vibration of it, and it made my chest tighten. She straightened up suddenly, rubbing the back of her neck as if embarrassed. For a moment, her eyes flicked away, scanning the room, and I caught a glimpse of tiredness in them, more than just the usual kind. Something heavier, like she'd carried this weight for years and didn't often let anyone notice. I wanted to say something, anything, but I stayed quiet, just close enough to feel the shift in her presence. When she finally met my gaze again, there was a subtle charge in the air, though nothing was said. I handed her another book, and our fingers brushed, quick, almost accidental, but enough to send that spark up my arm. She froze, just a fraction of a second, and then forced herself to step back, as if to remind herself that she had boundaries she needed to maintain. Thank you, she murmured, and I noticed the slight hitch in her voice, the almost hidden relief that someone had been patient enough to notice. She gave me a fleeting smile before turning toward the aisle, her movements calm but deliberate. I lingered a moment longer, watching her shoulders relax just slightly once she was out of sight. I couldn't stop thinking about that hesitation, that tiny, imperceptible flicker where she let something slip, something I wasn't supposed to see. Later, when I closed the shop for the night, I realized I kept replaying the moment. Her laugh, the tired crease near her eyes, the faint warmth when our fingers brushed. Something about her presence was quietly impossible, and I had no idea if I was supposed to stay away or lean in. And for the first time, I noticed how magnetic her quiet restraint was, how it pulled at me without permission. The rain started just as she walked into the bookstore that evening, the kind of persistent drizzle that made the city smell like wet asphalt and something faintly sweet from the cafe next door. I was stacking the returns by the register when she appeared, coat dripping slightly, hair plastered to her neck. "I forgot my umbrella," she said, though the tone was casual, like admitting it wasn't really a big deal. I grabbed a towel from the counter, offered it to her, and she took it with a quick, almost imperceptible nod. We ended up near the poetry aisle again, standing side by side while she scanned titles. Her shoulders brushed mine for a fraction of a second. It was so fleeting I thought I imagined it, but my chest still tightened. "You always know where to look?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, though inside I was aware of how close we were. She didn't answer immediately. Her hand lingered on the edge of a shelf, fingers tapping lightly, almost rhythmically, as if she were holding herself steady. Finally, she spoke, voice low, almost a whisper. "I sometimes just hope I'll find the right one." Her eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I could feel the weight of it. Not the words, but what she didn't say. Something unspoken hung between us, fragile and electrifying. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the phone on the counter buzzed, a text flashing from her ex, her face tightening just slightly as she glanced at it. She muttered a quick apology and stepped back, shielding herself behind a stack of books. The distance she created felt heavier than the rain outside. I wanted to reach for her, to offer something that wasn't there yet, but I didn't. I stayed still, careful not to cross the invisible line she'd just drawn. A minute later, she laughed softly at a line in a book she'd picked up, the sound catching in my chest. She was beautiful like this, guarded, precise, yet somehow letting the smallest cracks show. My hands itched to brush a stray strand of hair from her face, but I didn't. I reminded myself she hadn't asked for that. The storm outside intensified, tapping against the window like a nervous heartbeat, and we were left in a small bubble of quiet. I could feel the tension in the air, the electric possibility of proximity without permission. I realized she was leaning slightly toward me, just enough to make the world narrower, warmer, more immediate. But then, just as I was about to step closer, to maybe touch her hand, to maybe speak something I shouldn't, her ex called again, and her phone buzzed insistently. She flinched, apologized, and moved toward the register. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the space where she'd been, fingers tingling from the near contact. That brush of air, the ghost of her warmth, lingered. My mind kept playing it over. The tilt of her head, the soft flicker of her eyes meeting mine, the almost touch that wasn't. And even as she walked away, I knew I would remember that moment. The moment that almost happened, the quiet electricity that refused to be ignored. We found ourselves alone in the small cafe corner of the bookstore, late enough that the barista had already started stacking chairs on tables and muttering about closing. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the streets shiny and deserted, reflections of streetlights stretching like thin veins. I sat across from her, trying to focus on my coffee, but I couldn't. Every time she shifted, I noticed something new. The faint crease of fatigue under her eyes, the small trembling of her fingers as she traced the rim of her mug. She wasn't pretending anymore, not really. She was just human. I don't know why this is so hard, she said, voice low, almost lost in the hum of the fridge behind the counter. She didn't look at me directly at first, eyes fixed on the condensation sliding down her cup. I swallowed. My throat felt tight, hard. She finally lifted her gaze, and for a long moment, we just looked at each other. No jokes, no small talk, no deflections. Her stare was patient, but something raw hid in it. Something that invited a truth she wasn't yet ready to speak aloud. This, she said finally, gesturing vaguely between us. All of this, what are we doing? I don't even know anymore. Her hands curled slightly around the mug, white-knuckled, almost fragile. I felt my chest contract. Because I knew. I knew she meant more than the bookstore, more than coffee, more than casual proximity. And I knew I didn't have an answer, or maybe I did, and it scared me too much to speak it. I wanted to reach across the table, to bridge the small gap with something, anything, but instead, I stayed still, just watching the way her lips pressed together, the slight catch in her breath, the unspoken question she dared not finish. She leaned back, eyes downcast again, fingers absently brushing against the edge of the table. I feel like I've been waiting for something I didn't even know existed. And now it's here, and I don't know if I should move or step back. The words hit me in a way that was heavier than any touch could have been. No flirtation, no teasing, just a quiet, unpolished truth laid bare. And in that silence that followed, it was like the world had shrunk to just her and me and the soft ticking of the cafe clock. I tried to speak. I wanted to, but no words came out. So I just leaned slightly closer, careful not to cross the line, careful to let her decide if I belonged here. She exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. Her eyes met mine again, and there was a flicker of something I couldn't name. Fear, longing, confusion, maybe all of it. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered finally, and the words weren't about me, exactly. They were about her. About the impossible pull, the careful walls, the weight of years and choices that no one could undo. And then she looked down again, her hands tightening around the cup as though the mug cowl somehow anchor her to reality. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I could only watch. And somewhere in the quiet, in the space between heartbeats and unsaid confessions, I realized that I was no longer able to pretend this was just ordinary, just a coincidence, just a late-night visit to a bookstore. Because now, we were suspended in something fragile and dangerous, and neither of us could step away without breaking something vital. She raised her eyes to mine one last time before leaving, and the line she whispered, not to me, not fully, but to the air between us, made my chest ache in a way I wasn't prepared for. I don't know how to stop thinking about you. I wasn't expecting her to show up at the bookstore that morning. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening, and the city smelled faintly of wet cement and coffee. She appeared at the door like she belonged there, again, but this time, there was something different in her eyes. "Can I sit for a minute?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. She didn't wait for an answer, just slid onto the stool near the counter, placing her tote beside her. I noticed her hands first, knuckles pale, fingers fidgeting with the strap of her bag. There was a tension there I hadn't seen before. I got a letter yesterday," she started, almost under her breath. "From years ago." She paused, swallowing hard. It was from someone I loved and lost. I haven't. I didn't expect to hear from him again. Her eyes flicked to mine for a fraction of a second, like she was testing whether I'd understand before she went on. I nodded slowly. Do you want to talk about it? She shook her head, not quite refusing. Not really. I thought I had moved on. But reading it, it brought everything back. The mistakes, the timing, the regrets. Everything I thought I'd buried. I watched her as she traced the edge of the counter, her movements careful, almost reverent, as if touching it grounded her to the present. And then I saw it. The vulnerability she never let anyone see, the quiet ache beneath her composed exterior. You know, I said softly, sometimes the people we lose, they're not gone. They're just memories waiting for the right moment to remind us. She looked at me then, really looked, and I noticed the quick intake of breath, the faint tremor in her lips. I guess I've been waiting too long to let myself feel it, she admitted, almost whispering, almost hiding it. We were silent for a while after that. The only sounds were the distant hum of a vacuum in the back room and the occasional shuffle of books. I could see her jaw tightening as if she were holding herself together, trying not to let the past spill into the present. I wanted to say something, anything, but the right words didn't exist. Instead, I just stayed there, letting her story settle between us, letting the weight of it fill the small space. And then she reached into her tote and pulled out a photograph, small, faded around the edges. She held it carefully, like it could shatter if she squeezed too hard. She didn't speak, but her eyes told me everything. The longing, the regret, the quiet hope that maybe, somehow, life had another chapter. I reached out, gently, almost instinctively, to steady the photo. Our fingers brushed, and for the first time, I saw her completely unguarded. The walls she built weren't gone, but they were fragile, permeable, and for a moment, the air between us vibrated with possibility. She exhaled slowly, looking up at me. I don't know if this changes anything, or if it changes everything, she said, voice trembling just enough for me to feel it in my chest. And in that moment, the quiet magnitude of what she'd shared landed like a weight I didn't expect, but also a gift I didn't know I'd been waiting for. I realized, then, that nothing between us could ever be the same again. And her next glance, soft and fleeting, almost broke me. I think I needed to tell someone who might understand. It was raining again the next evening, but this time the sound of droplets against the windows felt softer, less like an intrusion and more like a quiet witness. She arrived at the bookstore in her usual calm, measured way, though something in her posture had shifted, less guarded, a little lighter. I was at the counter, stacking the day's returns, when she appeared in the doorway. Our eyes met, and for the first time, I didn't feel the tension of anticipation or the ache of waiting. There was something else now, something steady, mutual, undeniable. I thought I'd stop by, she said simply. No pretense, no hesitation, just words that were enough. I gestured toward the small corner by the poetry section, the one with the worn leather chair and the low light. Sit, I said. It wasn't an invitation, it was a recognition. A recognition of shared space, shared understanding. She lowered herself into the chair, and I stayed close, leaning against the edge of the counter. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of every conversation we hadn't had, every glance, every almost touch. We didn't speak at first. I noticed her hands resting lightly on her tote bag, fingers brushing against the fabric, and for a moment, I imagined the small act of reaching across and letting my hand cover hers. Something compelled me to do it, but I hesitated, letting her choice guide the moment. Her gaze found mine, lingering just long enough for me to see the honesty in her eyes. No walls, no pretenses, just the raw, human truth that had been building between us for weeks, months, years in echoes. Slowly, tentatively, I reached out, brushing my fingers against hers. She didn't pull away. She just let the contact linger, the smallest acknowledgement that we had crossed some invisible line together, and neither of us had planned it, but both of us needed it. We stayed like that for a long while. No words were necessary. Our breathing, the gentle shift of our hands, the quiet presence of each other, It said everything we hadn't dared to voice at one point. She leaned her head slightly, not toward me, but into the small space we'd carved out together. I noticed the soft sigh that escaped her lips, not relief, not surrender, but recognition. Recognition that what had been impossible or unspoken was now simply real. Time stretched and contracted around us. Outside, the rain continued, soft and rhythmic, but inside, everything had found its balance. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and I caught a faint smile, fleeting but enough to anchor the moment. No declarations, no promises, no grand gestures, just presence, just understanding, just the quiet certainty that neither of us could, or would, walk away this time. And when she finally shifted, letting her hand rest fully against mine, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to be. It was small, human, fragile, and perfect. The world didn't pause. The rain didn't stop. But for a heartbeat, everything that had been waiting between us had finally arrived. I leaned slightly closer, not to speak, not to touch more than needed, just to exist in that shared space. And in that silence, in the gentle press of our fingers, I realized that this quiet, earned connection was more than either of us could have hoped for, and yet exactly what we had been waiting for all along. Looking back now, it feels strange to remember how cautious we were, how carefully we tiptoed around something that was already shaping both of us. I see it in flashes, her pause at the poetry shelf, the way she let herself laugh even when her guard was up, the trembling of her hands when she finally admitted what she hadn't said for years. And I see myself, young and reckless in ways I hadn't realized, holding my breath over words I almost spoke, waiting for permission that never came. What changed, I think, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fireworks or grand gestures. It was the small things, the way she allowed herself to lean slightly closer, to let her hand brush mine, the way I learned to listen, really listen, without trying to fix anything. We learned that connection doesn't need declarations to be real, that closeness isn't always loud, and that some of the deepest understanding comes in silence. She's still her, confident, layered, precise, but she moves a little lighter now, more willing to let life intrude where she once drew careful lines. And I've changed too. I've learned patience, restraint, and the strange, thrilling beauty of noticing someone without demanding them. I've learned that love isn't always about conquest or ownership. Sometimes it's about presence, trust, and the quiet acknowledgement of what's been waiting all along. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about that first day, how she whispered those words I couldn't forget, and I realize we've been shaped by our almost moments as much as by the moments we finally allowed ourselves to inhabit. I understand now that the tension, the hesitation, the long silences, all of it mattered. Without it, we wouldn't have arrived here, seated side by side in quiet recognition, knowing we didn't need to rush, that we could simply be. And the most surprising thing is how ordinary it all feels now. The extraordinary was never the words or the gestures. It was the subtle gravity of our shared space, the unspoken decisions that built this fragile, real connection between us. I can't say what the future holds, but I can say this. Whatever comes next, I carry the lessons of waiting, noticing, and trusting that love, in its quietest, most patient form, can find a way to settle exactly where it belongs. And sometimes, late at night, when the city hums softly outside the bookstore, I still feel that first spark, the small, improbable moment that changed everything, and I smile. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?